Hello, I'm health educator Nina Belle, and welcome to the Sick with Success podcast, where we talk about chronic illness and how it affects organizations as well as individuals in the workplace. Joining me is the man who wrote the book on chronic illness and career engagement, Jason Reid. Jason, welcome.
Hello, Nina, and hello to all of our listeners. Thank you for joining us.
For those of you who don't know Jason, he is an award-winning former journalist and manager who has been challenged by chronic illness all his life. And now he runs Sick with Success. It's a company he created to help organizations better engage their workers who have chronic illness. Before we get into today's topic, Jason, I'm curious, how are things going about getting out your message?
Well, things have been going really well, Nina. Thank you for asking. I've been out speaking to some very influential groups so far this year, the Ontario Healthy Workplace Coalition and the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, two great examples. And it's been great. We've had record numbers of companies attend these events, and they're all eager to find ways to better engage their employees with chronic illness. So it's amazing to see how many of them come away transformed because they're hearing information that's simple, honest, and effective, but it's information that actually very few people are talking about. And I think organizations are becoming to realize how expensive this thing called chronic illness is. Not just in terms of benefits and drug costs, which we talked about last program, but also in terms of productivity. And, we're getting interest from people in upper management who themselves are challenged by chronic conditions. And let's not forget that chronic illness doesn't discriminate. It affects people at the top of the corporate ladder just as much as the bottom. So it's always beneficial, to listen to somebody who's been there and who can coach you through the process of managing work and health at the same time.
Well, and good for you for getting the conversation started, because we both know being educated about how these chronic health problems affect people's productivity is key.
That's right.
And that's why today we're going to talk about the difference between acute illness and chronic illness. For those of you in the human resources or management fields, this may sound like we're going to get into some detailed medical information. Jason, why is this conversation so important?
Well, it is an important conversation. And first of all, we should mention, we're not going to talk about specific symptoms or use any medical jargon because really a lot of these concepts as they relate to work are actually really simple and they actually have a practical work application. But you're really right about this being an important discussion and important distinctions. In fact, this may be the most important discussion we have on the issue of employee health and productivity because the paradigm of illness, which is, the essence, the basic assumptions about what it means to be sick, these have changed so dramatically in the past decade or two. You know that as well as I do. And, the basic assumptions that people have about illness are really important because they underlie all of the policies and all of the other tools that we have in our disposal in organizations that affect employee health and employee productivity. So when we talk about these distinctions and characteristics, it's going to be about 5 to 10 minutes or so, but it's going to be really important information. And believe me, it's going to be worth people's time.
Well, let's start. So why don't we begin with acute illness? These are illnesses that everybody knows about. Is that right?
That's right. When we imagine a worker who is sick, we usually think of somebody who has, the flu or strep throat or maybe even a stomach bug. And these are acute conditions. And the word acute itself means rapid or urgent. We know that most acute illnesses are actually generally infections of some kind. They can be viral or they can also be bacterial. And with that, generally these conditions are also temporary too. And they're temporary, they are visible. Usually we can tell when people with these illnesses are sick. And they're also predictable too. When you get any sort of infection, either one of two things happens. Either you fight it and you get well again, or you die. So predictable and temporary.
And those are some of the things where most of us are familiar with. But you and I both know that our society has gone through a major shift in the type of illnesses we now have to deal with. So vaccines and antibiotics have really reduced our levels of acute illness, while a different type of illness, that's chronic illness, has been growing dramatically. So what can you tell us about chronic illness?
Well, when you mention growing dramatically, I think that's a really good way to put it. A lot of people don't realize how many chronic illnesses in general there are out there. The World Health Organization, for instance, identifies more than 70
Wow.
different types of chronic illness. So we're talking about a lot of different illnesses here. And interestingly, the word chronic means ongoing or long-lasting. And what we find are the characteristics of chronic illness are actually the opposite of acute condition. So it's a different type of illness.
So now you do such a great job in your book explaining chronic illness in a way that's so easy for all of us to understand. So what are those characteristics and how can managers remember them?
Well, yeah, you mentioned the book. I actually developed a great acronym, an easy acronym that will help people remember the characteristics of chronic illness. And that acronym is UILL, U-I-L-L. And you can almost think of it as a question if you're asking somebody if they're sick. You ill? And here's what it stands for. The U stands for unpredictable because pretty much all chronic illnesses are unpredictable. People have flare-ups, they have remissions, as you well know. And the I stands for invisible because most of the symptoms of chronic illness aren't visible to the average person. And the double L stands for long-lasting. So again, it's unpredictable, invisible, long-lasting. These are the characteristics of chronic illness.
Something that's important to note. Not only are these characteristics of chronic and acute illness different, but they are totally the opposite.
That's right. And, when we look at workplace strategies, we have to realize that because we have everything geared towards visible, predictable, and temporary, which is what we're used to. That's the old paradigm of illness. And now we're dealing with unpredictable, invisible, and long-lasting, being our new reality. So, for instance, if you had a worker that had the flu, the experience of that type of illness is totally different than the experience of having something like arthritis or asthma or diabetes. And again, this means the strategies that we have to use to keep these workers working is totally different as well.
Such a clear distinction, isn't it? And this is actually something I'd like to speak about in greater detail after the break, so please stay with us. But first, I'd like to ask you, our listeners, to send us an email with any questions or comments you may have. We would love to address your topic on a future episode of the show, so please contact us at podcast@sickwithsuccess.com and let us know if you have a comment or a question. Please include your name and where you're writing from so that we can acknowledge your input. We would love to hear from you. We're back in 30 seconds.
If you have enjoyed this podcast and are interested in more information about engaging workers with health problems, please check out Jason's new book, Thriving in the Age of Chronic Illness, available at Amazon.com in both traditional print and Kindle versions. To order it from our website, go to sickwithsuccess.com.
And we're back. I'm health educator Nina Belle with chronic illness and employee engagement expert Jason Reid. Jason, before the break, you were talking about the differences between traditional illnesses like the flu and chronic illness such as arthritis, diabetes, or asthma. Can you sum that up again for anyone who may not have heard that the first time?
Yeah, it's actually fairly simple. If you think of acute illness, which is the old type of illness like the flu, the characteristics of those type of illnesses are that they are visible, predictable, and temporary. And then we have chronic illnesses, which are actually totally the opposite characteristics. They are unpredictable, invisible, and long-lasting.
Jason, you go into chronic illness and the unpredictability of it in greater detail in your book, but can you break it down in a few sentences for us?
Yeah, the unpredictable nature of chronic illness is quite interesting, and a lot of people don't entirely understand it. On one hand, you have diseases, especially autoimmune diseases such as arthritis and MS, where people go through cycles of flare-ups and remissions. And these flare-up episodes can happen over the course of years or sometimes even months. Now, in addition to that, you have basically the day-to-day symptoms. And many of the day-to-day symptoms of chronic illness can wax and wane. They can get, more intense, and they can sort of back off. at different times during the day. So you may have somebody the first 2 hours at work, they may feel terrible. And then the next 2 hours, they may feel pretty well. And then a couple hours after that, they may be, fatigued or nauseated. So these things can really change. They're unpredictable in that way. The other area of unpredictability is something that is referred to as comorbidities. And what this means is that people who have a chronic illness are actually much more likely to have more than one. And in fact, we know about 3/4 of people with a chronic condition have more than one. And there are also some people out there, a significant number, that have more than 5 of these chronic diseases. So you can imagine the balance that happens when you have a flare-up of one disease and you're trying to treat it and then something else happens. So, we have to realize that even things like medications can cause reduced work functionality. And obviously, if you have a lot of illnesses, you're taking a lot of medication, and that can affect people as well. So we sometimes think of illness as very simple, but in actuality, chronic illness is something that's much more complex.
And unfortunately, chronic illness is invisible. And unfortunate, and you're going to tell us why.
Yeah, again, you can't see the symptoms. And when I do conferences and I do speaking engagements, I actually have this picture that I took at Queen's University, where I'm speaking to a large group of young people, and most of them actually have chronic conditions. They actually created a club called the Invisibilities Club, which is a short form for invisible disabilities. And you look at these young adults, and none of them look sick. I always challenge the people in the audience and say, okay, can you pick out which ones who are sick and which ones who aren't? And no one can do it. And, I think something like that really shows that, people can be dealing with a lot of health issues and have it not be seen. And that's an issue for organizations.
Absolutely, because they can't see it.
Well, yeah, if you can't see the problem, then what you have to do is rely on your employees to take responsibility, to come forward and access the resources that are available to them, whether it's an employee assistance program or a wellness program, or even, if it's a conversation with their manager, because those are often the most profitable conversations, because if you get the illness out in the open, you can often find ways around productivity problems. But a lot of people don't want to come forward because, frankly, they worry that they won't be believed because their illness is not visible.
So we've got all that, and then it's long-lasting. So what can you tell us about long-lasting? What does that mean?
Well, this is another thing that some people have a really hard time kind of wrapping their head around. A lot of these illnesses are, in fact, incurable. And a lot of people don't realize that, folks can live with an incurable illness and actually, live pretty decent lives with an incurable illness. And most people, when they think of incurable illness, they think of something that's, likely terminal and is going to kill you. But that's not necessarily the case. It's funny, in my own experience, I remember one young HR person asking me how long that I'd been sick. And when I said 30 years, she nearly fell off her chair because it just wasn't something that she actually thought about in terms of somebody living with a long-lasting illness.
Well, Jason, I think this is something we could devote a whole entire program to, these individual UIL acronyms that we talk about. But before we do leave today, maybe you should let's bring it all back to the beginning. Why should organizations care about these types of characteristics?
The important thing to realize is that illness has changed. It has changed dramatically. And the effect of illness on our workers has changed too. The problem is that our assumptions within our organizations, as well as our policies and everything else, have not changed. So they're really ineffective in dealing with these new problems. So as long as our managers, for instance, don't know about chronic health conditions, they can't really have meaningful conversations with their staff on how to deal with these issues. And they can't build the trust that's needed for people to come forward. So I think going forward, we have to realize that there's a lot of new training that we need to provide to our managers and our leaders and even our employees so that we can rethink employee health and have more productive organizations.
And that's all about getting that conversation going.
Absolutely.
So for those of you who listened to podcast number 1 and heard about the enormous productivity costs that chronic illness takes on our businesses, why aren't more people talking about these distinctions and doing this type of awareness training already with their staff?
Well, Nina, I think the smart ones are. And the ones who are reaping the benefits in both higher productivity and also much lower health and treatment costs. But I think for some companies, and even, we could say society in general, there's a bit of a reluctance to talk about chronic illness in an honest and accurate way. After hearing our discussion on this podcast about the characteristics of chronic illness, we can appreciate why organizations just kind of want it to go away. Because, as we mentioned, chronic illness is unpredictable. So we can't always see it, which is an issue as well. And it can also last for a long time. And our organizations really don't like problems that are unpredictable, invisible, and long-lasting, as you can imagine. And our industrial economy has been all about putting people in predictable pigeonholes in a lot of ways, setting up, a process and uniform rules for everyone and treating everyone as though that they have the same needs as employees. But chronic illness really challenges all of these old strategies. It challenges us to create new ones because it just doesn't work in this environment. But on the plus side, we now have these fantastic technologies that allow a lot more flexibility in the workplace, whether it's people, working from home or whether it's, some sort of physical accommodation in the workplace. There's so many things that we can do now. And we're much better equipped to deal with this issue than we really ever have been before in the workplace. But our first big step is to recognize this new reality that we're living in and start to fashion a strategy to get us where we want to go. And I guess that in itself sounds like it could be the topic of our next podcast, couldn't it?
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. It certainly could. And let's do that.
Sounds good.
Let's also remind you, our listeners, that we're eager to hear from you. So please send us your questions and your comments to podcast@sickwithsuccess.com. That's sickwithsuccess.com. All one word. We'd love to include your question or topic on a future program. And if you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe so that you get regular updates and information about our new episodes. Also, please rate us on iTunes and leave a review if you are able. We really appreciate it.
The most effective way to deal with chronic illness and invisible disabilities in the workplace is to train your staff, starting with your managers and supervisors. Sick with Success has the right training plan for you. From engagement and awareness training to energy management seminars, Sick with Success can provide your organization with information and skills you can't get anywhere else. Please check us out at www.sickwithsuccess.com.
You want this experience to be interesting and informative, and so do we. Please write to us and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in our future episodes. I'm Nina Belle for Jason Reid. Until next time, may you find health and success.